The panelists could please join me. Oh, they are. Please stay in your seats. We want to move quickly to this panel and our concluding session.
Hoping that the foreign minister would stay. She's not.
No, she was going to go off to another meeting. It's kind of speech.
Oh, very good.
Well done for raising the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
That was otherwise unspoken. I thought you did really great.
What did she say? I thought she actually gave a pretty good answer. Well, we're now moving into the final straight. We've had in these plenary panels discussion of political change, cultural change, social change, and now we're going to deal with strategic changes, of which there are many to speak of, not just in this region, where the pillars of an old order are now shaking and undergoing transformational changes. But beyond the upheavals in the Arab world, there is the issue of Iran's nuclear ambitions, which are preoccupying much of the rest of the world. And while that's going on, there is a broad and I think profound change taking place in the structure of the international system that comes about as a result of the rise of new powers, particularly in Asia. The rise of China, the rise of India, and indeed, although little remarked upon, the rise of Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil. These are new powers on the international stage who are demanding a role, their rightful role, and also beginning to grapple with the responsibilities that come from participating as a leading actor in the emerging global order. In that context, the United States is also shifting its strategy. Some in the Obama administration have called it the pivot, although I think they've come to regret that already. The pivot towards Asia. But if you pivot towards something, you're pivoting away from something. And the implication, though little stated publicly, but manifest in several developments, is clear. The United States, as we heard from Dennis McDonough, the Deputy National Security Advisor last night, is ending its involvement in two wars in the Middle East that it has been involved in for 10 years, decade long. The American people are weary of wars in the Middle East. And they are reluctant, as we see in the case of Syria, to start a new one. At the same time, there is a sense of great opportunity and challenge developing for American interests further to the east from here, in South Asia and East Asia and Southeast Asia. And the intention of the United States is to pay greater attention to that and to be less involved in the affairs of this region. And that is compounded by something we haven't discussed at all in this conference, at least not yet, which is that the American vital interest in oil in this region is also changing quite dramatically. Today, the United States imports only 10% of its oil from this region, from the Gulf region. I dare say in the next 3 years, because of the gas revolution that's taking place in the United States, that dependence will decline to zero. At the same time, these rising powers in the East, China and India, are importing, in the case of India today, some 65% of its oil, in the case of China, 50% of its oil from the Gulf. And that is rising rapidly. So that within the context of these dramatic global changes comes a also dramatic, transformational, though little remarked upon, change in the way in which the United States on the one side and the rising powers on the other side view their interests in this region. And that inevitably has an impact on everything else that we've been discussing. So that's what we want to discuss here in the final session, as well as a few other issues of strategic importance. To engage in this discussion, we have a diverse panel of experts. Endi Bayuni, the senior editor of the Jakarta Post, the major English language daily newspaper in Indonesia, is a foreign affairs columnist for that paper as well, and has spent time in the United States, in particular as a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. Corey Shark, a research fellow at the Hoover Institution in Washington, D.C., has had a distinguished career in the United States government on national security issues, both in the State Department and the Defense Department. Colin Cowell, to her left, a professor at Georgetown University in Washington, not in Doha, and also a senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security, was only recently the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East in the Obama administration. And finally, Nabil Fahmy, now Dean of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo, but a distinguished diplomat from the Egyptian Foreign Service who played a critical role in earlier days in negotiations between Israel and the Palestinians, and also in arms control talks. He's probably Egypt's leading expert on that issue, and of course a very important service as the Egyptian ambassador to the United States. I should add one other thing about Colin and Corey. Colin, I think, if I'm correct, or he will correct me, is an advisor to the re-election campaign for President Obama, and Corey did play a critical role as foreign policy advisor for the McCain-Palin campaign, and rumor has it that she's playing a similar role for the Romney campaign. So in that context, I wanted to start with Endi first, and give us, please, the perspective from Southeast Asia, in particular from Indonesia, of these dramatic developments that are taking place, particularly in Asia, and how you see that impacting on Indonesia's role as the largest Muslim state.
Thank you, Martin. Well, First of all, I want to thank Martin and the Brookings Institution and the Kuwaiti Foreign Ministry for bringing me here. I always feel that as coming from Indonesia, we represent the voice from the fringes of the Islamic world in more ways than one. Of course, geographically, we are right on the eastern flank of the Muslim world. I was somewhat surprised yesterday when Dennis McDonough described the Muslim world spanning from Marrakesh to Kuala Lumpur. And sort of, okay, where is Indonesia here? And when he expanded it to include his hometown, Minneapolis, he still stops in Kuala Lumpur and excludes Indonesia. But I actually have to thank him because Indonesia, we don't see ourselves as part of, we don't see ourselves as a Muslim state or Muslim country. In fact, most of us would feel uneasy to be being described like that. We are a country with the largest Muslim population. We can be described as the largest democracy in predominantly Muslim world, but we are not a Muslim state, we are not a Muslim country. Because the moment we describe that, we would play into our domestic politics. So I personally think that Dennis was not totally wrong in describing, in excluding Indonesia from the map. But having said that, I think Indonesia is being the largest, the country with the largest Muslim population. We do have a voice, because in the Muslim world, by the sheer size of our population. And also lately, especially in the last 14 years, as we become a democracy, we can actually become more confident in speaking up on issues like democracy, human rights, and all those things in the international fora. And we have been doing that within ASEAN, and then, of course, in the United Nations, and also in OIC. Indonesia hosted the first season of the Permanent Independent Commission on Human Rights of the OIC early this year. And in fact, the chair of that commission is actually a woman from Indonesia. So that reflects on how, on the progressiveness of Indonesia. And I think you rightly mentioned Indonesia becoming a regional power in East Asia because for three very good reasons. One, the size of the population. Second, the stability of the democracy and the political situation. And third, the economy. The chairman of the Senate yesterday described Indonesia, the Indonesian economy growing rapidly. Now we are members of the G20, and within the next 10 or 15 years, we will be within the top 10 of the largest economies in the world. So that gives Indonesia kind of a claim to be a power. I wouldn't say, well, definitely not a superpower, but definitely a middle power or regional power in Asia, in East Asia, or if you like, also a power, a middle power within the Islamic world, because that's also something that Indonesia aspires to, and in its foreign policy, to play a bigger role in the global forum. So we are observing the rise of China, the rise of India, and I think everybody is kind of dumbstruck very impressed by what's happening in China. But we should also not forget the rise of the middle powers. Of course, in East Asia, Indonesia is one of them, and being a middle power or a power in the region allows Indonesia to pursue a more independent and active foreign policy. And not necessarily in allying ourselves with the United States or with China. And Indonesia has had that history throughout the Cold War, when we in India and a few other countries took the initiative with the non-aligned movement. So we have had that history, and I think we're going to be doing, we will be relying on that experience and history to pursue a more independent foreign policy, even as China is, now is flexing its muscles. And the United States is concerned about, its I wouldn't say diminishing, but relative to China, the loss of some of influence in Asia. The general feeling among the majority of Asian countries is the United States should have a presence in Asia, and but not necessarily in confrontation with China. This is, I think, the very reason why we need the presence of regional powers or middle powers to try to to negotiate to make sure that the contestation between the two superpowers, China and United States, does not lead to conflict. I mean, there are, of course, signs of there are tensions growing now in the South China Sea, for example, and also in closer to Japan in the Northeast China Sea. And the last thing we want is for a war or for this tension to develop into full-blown conflict. Let me just talk about how we see the development in the Middle East. I think in the Middle East, of course, if the United States is scaling down its presence, I believe that the United States will continue, of course, because and when it comes to Middle East, I guess the security of Israel is the central issue within the U.S. foreign policy. And but now with the Arab awakening, things are changing. Although I presume that Israel's security will remain the central interest of the U.S. foreign policy, but we also have to recognize the rise of new powers in the Middle East. Of course, Iran with its nuclear power is a concern, but don't forget Turkey. Turkey is also emerging and now playing a role in the region. And we wish to see Egypt, because by the size of its population, it should be a regional power. It is not at the moment because of the domestic problems, but we would like to see Egypt to stabilize after these elections, to go back to the question of development. Of course, they continue with the reforms because this is a never-ending process. Indonesia, we have been doing this for the last 14 years. We still haven't got it right, but at least we can claim we have a functioning democracy. We have elections, free and fair election, democratic. We have had 4 presidents. My message to my friends in Egypt is, for the next few years, it's going to be ugly. There will be a lot of violence. We had that too. We went through that period, but I think we pulled through and we managed. Now we are stabilizing. I hope, or I wish for Egypt to go through the same process and to get its act together, because we need the presence of Egypt as a regional power, along with Turkey and Iran, of course, with Israel, to maintain peace in the region. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to come back to civil-military relations and what we can learn from that in Indonesia. But let's go straight to Egypt, Nabil. And I should say that Nabil may have to leave us a little early. He's got a flight to catch, so if he suddenly disappears off the end of the panel, you'll understand why. But Nabil, it's great to have you here. And I wonder if you could address the point that Andy makes, which is that Egypt's role is missing for the time being, for understandable reasons. But when it reemerges, what is it likely to look like? It's for 30 years, it's been a stable ally of the United States in this region. It's been really our pillar, our most important pillar for stabilizing the region. What's a new Egyptian foreign policy going to look like when Egypt reassumes its leadership role?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. And Martin, I think I want to also thank you for the way you started this session. It is really about all of us looking at strategic thinking differently, because it is a new world, not only in the Middle East, in many different places. Before jumping into Egypt, let me simply say that in my discussions with Americans in the past, and in my discussions with Egyptians about America, I've been arguing for years that America has to be looked at as a global power rather than simply a superpower, because there's no real symmetrical competition. It's much more complicated, much more complex. as you describe your interest internationally to your own constituency, it's not all about some major threat out there against you. And also, frankly, back home in Egypt, when people would say, well, why isn't America paying attention? Well, it has other things on its mind around the world and other interests. The same thing applies to how we look at the world now, and I will then get into post-election foreign policy. If you look at the issues you raised, shifting energy interests, shifting markets, new powers emerging, we have them all in Egypt, actually, even before the revolution. We had the Chinese suddenly becoming interested in the Suez Canal, in making investments there, Turkey, India, Brazil, all taking part. And we as Egyptians have to look at the world as a larger community, not only having replaced the Soviet Union in the past by America and now having our dependency only on the West. It doesn't mean it would be at the expense of the West. But yes, in a way, part of what our inclination was towards the West will have to shift. But the same applies to Egypt itself. I mean, America will not be the sole power out there. Egyptians love to say we're the mother of the world, and we still do, and I will say it. But anyway, when we talked about leading the Arab world, when we did it in the past, when the Arab League started, there were 6 countries. Now there are 22, so the way we lead doesn't mean by exclusion. We have to play the role, and it has to be resumed, but it can't be, we'll be the sole leader any longer. If we start realizing that, we can then take the proper role in the way it should be. What will you see in terms of Egypt, especially vis-a-vis the West and the US, in the years to come? Look, if we put together, let me say also here that our democratic process will take time, even after the elections. I agree with what you just said. And I've often used the phrase that we don't do springs, we do long, hot summers. But I accept the metaphor that we're moving forward. So this will take time. If we succeed, however, our system will be more transparent for ourselves and for others, more accountable for ourselves and for others, more representative. In other words, there'll be more voices speaking about Egyptian domestic and foreign policy, and more competitive. You will have presidents changing. You will have the leaders of government changing. We have to take that into account, and you will have to get used to it. So what I expect to happen in Egypt, if we succeed, is a much more complex situation for the world, because you've been used to having one address, and I say one by way of the regime per se, not by way of a person, because of course you had military intelligence, political and all that, but in essence, you will have to take into account, as we will, as we pursue our foreign policy, we will have to listen to the liberals, the Islamists, the socialists, and develop the consensus gradually. So how do you do that and deal with the real world? I see America as being a very prominent player for the next 2 decades at least. So American-Egyptian relations and with the West will remain extremely important to us under any circumstances, whether we succeed or fail in democracy. And any Egyptian government will have to take that into account. But it has to be managed differently. It can't be without explaining to people why this is important. We only talk about the relationship in America or in Egypt when there's a problem or a peace agreement, and you can't do that to many of those. So there's no real explanation why the relationship is important. You will have to take into account our parochial domestic politics, as we will. Double standards, as we see them, will become a problem in the relationship, even if we're wrong, because it's part of the political game. And I say this with all due respect, I had to deal with very young members of Congress for years on very parochial issues when I was the ambassador in Washington, because that's what America was. Now, I promise you it will be more complicated and more complex for us first and then for the world. But I honestly don't see any ideological shift away from the West towards another part of the world, but I would promote that, yes, we need to look at Asia, we need to look at the new emerging states, we need to have a relationship with America that is clear to both sides, defining what we can do and what we can't do. We can't possibly take the same position on issues that America does when you have a global perspective and we have a regional perspective, when you clearly have a priority vis-a-vis Israel versus, if you want, the Palestinians in the peace process. I'm being a bit crude here, but there will be these issues. And if we define the Egyptian-American relationship as only being part of the Arab-Israeli peace process, then we will be at loggerheads. And if you do the same, if that we have to agree with what you want to do, or we can't be strong in our criticism of settlement expansion, well, you're going to face problems because we will. I expect us to have a foreign policy that shifts slowly to be more inclusive, and I will support that and promote that. And I will expect the foreign policy to remain the same by way of its strategic direction, but it won't be. You cannot insulate it or isolate it from incremental pressures on it gradually. So if we have a lot of small problems, ultimately that will shift the direction of it. But the Egyptians, whether it's an Islamist government or a secular president, in fact, actually, there are more Islamist parties that have gone up to Washington in the last 12 months than there were liberals. And every American politician who has come to Egypt has gone to the Brotherhood to meet them. It's out of self-interest. And I support that, by the way. I support the engagement. We need to do it. But yes, the more we open up, and we will open up, the pace we have to decide, but we will open up. The more we open up, it becomes a much more complicated relationship. But I would argue it's probably a much more sustainable one because we live in a different environment today. We could not continue not to have an open society in today's environment. Well, we could have 60 years ago, as could most of the world. So it's a different world, and we have to be part of it.
Colin, you had your Pentagon hat on not so long ago, looking at these kinds of strategic changes in the region, particularly in terms of America's position in the region, and it's the way its interests are shifting, the way I described. So, how do you see the dynamics at play here, and where do you see the United States heading in terms of its own strategy for the region and the broader Muslim world?
Well, you know, I was at the Pentagon from the beginning of 2009, I think about 3 weeks after inauguration, through the end of 2011. And I spent the first 2 years of my job. My portfolio spanned from Egypt up through Israel and the Levant to Iraq, Iran, down the Gulf and Arabian Peninsula to Yemen. So I didn't do Libya and I didn't do Afghanistan and Pakistan. I just did the easy countries sandwiched in between.
And you didn't do Indonesia?
I didn't do Indonesia either. But I did know that it was a Muslim country. You know, I would say the first 2 years in my job, my day-to-day life was dominated by the three I's, some combination of Iraq, Iran, and Israel. Iraq, because we had 140,000 forces that we were trying to extricate ourselves from that conflict with some dignity and a modicum of stability. Iran, because of the challenge its destabilizing and hegemonic ambitions play, as well as its nuclear program, and Israel because of our close defense relationship and the interrelationship with the Iran issue and so many others. And then the Arab awakening happened, and so suddenly, you know, day-to-day issues related to Egypt and Bahrain and Syria and Yemen and others. So, I think there's something in that, in much of the shift that you described. I think for decades, the politics in this part of the world were dominated. The fundamental cleavage was the Arab-Israeli cleavage, which was really grafted on top of the Cold War competition as well. I think since the end of the Cold War, the cleavage is largely between kind of actors favoring resistance, with Iran being very much at the center of that, but also Hezbollah, Hamas, other Palestinian militant groups, insurgents in Iraq, you can name them, but really Iran being the center of gravity with that, and a more moderate camp that had strange bedfellows in it. The United States was in it, Israel was in it, but also some of the Sunni Arab regimes. I think the Arab awakening has overturned that model. I don't think that we can describe the region's cleavages fundamentally in that way. I mean, I think that still Iran and its geopolitical ambitions is one of the 800-pound gorillas in this part of the world, but it's not the only dynamic driving things. And for the average person in this part of the world, isn't the dominant feature of their concerns. I actually think we see, if you kind of stick with that resistance axis and a more moderate camp, I think you see the emergence of a third pole. And that pole it hasn't fully emerged yet, but we can see its basic shape. And that is the role of Sunni political Islam in a more populist, nationalist, and democratizing region. And what it's doing is it's attracting elements away from those other two camps, the moderate camp and the resistance camp. So you can see this, for example, in the way in which Hamas is distancing itself to some degree from the Syrians and the Iranians and moving closer to the Egyptians. I imagine that will continue in the years ahead. I think in general, the Muslim Brotherhood, not just in Egypt but across the region, is one of the big winners so far in the Arab Spring. And I think their organization, their longstanding connections to communities across in so many countries. And so in Turkey actually plays has some interesting connectivity with that as well. So I think that we're starting to see a fundamental reshaping of the major cleavages or polarities in this part of the world, not unlike the shift from the Arab-Israeli cleavage to the resistance versus moderate cleavage, and we don't know exactly what that shape is going to take. What it means for the United States, I think, is unclear. I think in some ways it makes the geopolitical environment easier. Because I think the two biggest losers in the Arab Spring have been al-Qaeda and Iran. I think some of the turmoil in places like Syria and Yemen and to some degree the Sinai have provided some opportunities for extremists, but I think the overwhelming effect of the Arab Spring will be to really serve almost a death blow to al-Qaeda's ideology. And I think that's, as important as the death of bin Laden and some of the folks who have met an end in Yemen and elsewhere has been, I think the biggest blow to al-Qaeda will be the ideological devastation of the Arab Spring. Thomas Friedman said that there's a certain kind of irony in the fact that Osama bin Laden spent the last couple of weeks of his life watching the Egyptian people accomplish something that he and his Egyptian deputy, Ayman al-Zawahiri, now al-Qaeda's #1, could never do through violence. I think Iran has also been a huge loser in the Arab Spring. I think as individuals on the Arab street turn to their own governments for legitimacy and to meet their needs, their temptation to turn towards Iran and its resistance narrative will go down. I think the perception that Iran is meddling in this part of the world has devastated their soft power. You can see that in all the opinion polls. I think for a while the Iranians were fairly confident that Syria was safe from these trends, and we now know that it isn't. Hezbollah is nervous, Hamas is nervous. So I think Iran is nervous. Whether from a geopolitical perspective, the United States is a winner or a loser, I don't know. I think it has made the region more complicated because it's introduced new actors. And I think in some places, Egypt is a good example, we'll have to see what our security cooperation and our relationship looks like with new countries. And I think that if we stick with the notion that we have to ground our policies in a mix of mutual interest and mutual respect and understand that we're not going to agree on everything. One of the closest relationships we have in the world is with Turkey, and we don't agree with the Turkish government on everything. And I imagine that as Egypt rises, our relationship could mirror very much what our relationship with Turkey looks like, which is that we have a hard core of strategic interests in common, but we're not going to agree on everything. And so as we try to navigate through that, it'll be more complicated. But I'm kind of, if you ask me in the next 6 months or a year, am I optimistic about stability in this part of the world, my answer would be no. If you ask in the 5 to 10 year horizon, I think the answer is yes. And I think we can move away from some of the zero-sum ways in which the region has been described into a more positive sum analysis.
Great, thank you. Corey, looking at it through Republican-tinted glasses, do you see the strategic landscape differently, or the U.S. role any differently to what Colin has described?
I do think that the changes in the Middle East have been extraordinarily important geostrategically. I should start, though, by saying thanks, because it's actually been a huge privilege to spend the last couple of days in the company of people who are changing the world. It's really inspiring to see what people are doing in civil society, in governments, newly elected members of parliament, and the discussion that they are having about the boundaries of civic space. It seems to me that one of the most important changes geostrategically that has come about as a result of the change that people in this part of the world have demanded for themselves is that it heightens the incongruity of American domestic and foreign policy. And for example, in countries that we believed to be stable because they were run by one powerful figure turn out not to be stable. And that shouldn't surprise us, but we overinvested in relationships with Musharraf, with Mubarak, with others in a way that is actually not in our interests, and yet we had persuaded ourselves it was, because the complicated path to building a deep and intimate relationship with another country in a way that, as the Egyptian ambassador said, we expect others to understand about us. You know, that it amazes me that a country that pioneered the 24-hour news cycle, that has a perpetual political campaign, that has Madison Avenue and Hollywood, is hesitant to get in and engage in the narrative and the domestic debates of other countries. This is what we do well as a society at home, and we need to limber ourselves up to give our friends and allies in the region that same kind of respect. I have been struck listening to the conversations in the last few days here at how much people are thirsting for accountable governments. And that we very often, in the American perception of looking at the world and looking at this region in particular, think about the advance of democracy, and that what folks here are talking about is that, but they talk about it more in terms of the rule of law and the social compact, which is a richer way of having that conversation. And I think that helps the United States both to understand these societies and to feel a sense of deep commonality with it. It is great for the United States that the people of the countries of the Middle East are demanding governments accountable to them, are insisting that the dignity of individual rights matters and governments have to take it account, and that people ran risks to make that happen is hugely ennobling. And the United States ought to be uncomplicatedly in favor of that. Even as I agree with Colin, it's going to be a bumpy ride. It'll be a difficult transition. I think important geostrategic changes that I see as the result of this, everything gets more complicated, as the ambassador and Colin both pointed out, but also it gets easier in a lot of ways, because the kinds of conversations that folks in the region are having have a commonality and a universality that's acknowledged to all of us. You know, in the 1980s, political scientists and governments had this conversation about whether the people of Africa really cared about democracy and individual rights. And of course they did, right? Most African countries are now on their fourth transition of government when the great change there. In the 1990s, we had a conversation about Asian values and whether the people of Asia really care about democracy and individual rights. And of course they do, right? It's not. And in the 2000s, we had a conversation about whether the people of the so-called Arab world care about these things. And of course they do, right? Everybody wants a government they can hold accountable. And when people demand that for themselves, that's great for them, and it's great for the United States. Who it has been bad for. I agree with Colin that the Iranian narrative had been that they were the model for this region, the legitimacy. And when change tried to come to Iran, and the government of Iran cracked down so shamefully on its own people, that delegitimized them as a model in the region, and in a way that they are struggling to find their feet again. And the extent to which they are beholden to success of the Assad regime in Syria only furthers that. I also think another important geostrategic change that the flowering of democracy in the Middle East has brought is that it's expanded the spectrum of Arab reactions to things. 10 years ago, perhaps you could have judged by the Saudi reaction what the reaction of the countries of this region would be, and no more. Right? The government of Qatar has made a very interesting set of choices about helping support representative governance in other places. And lots of countries are having their own specific reactions, and that's broadening up the spectrum both of choice as countries change and also of policies in a way that makes the world more complicated and better. Turkey has emerged as an important model for the countries of the region for several reasons. I was struck listening to the foreign minister of Pakistan this morning at how much the success that the Turkish people have had in bringing a moderate Islamic government to power that pushed the military and intelligence services out of the central policy-making role in foreign and security policy. The struggles that they are having with freedom of the media and some of the bad choices that they are making domestically, their vibrant economy and the smart way that they're addressing those choices. There are lots of good models for the people of the region to grab onto. I also think the center of gravity has shifted back to the western part of the Middle East, to North Africa, to Egypt, to countries that 100 years ago were the center of gravity in the region because of the choices that Egyptians and Libyans and Tunisians have made over the course of the last 2 years. The center of gravity and interest has shifted back to them. And I think that too is really important. So lots of change going on, lots of complexity. Countries are coming to terms with the fundamental things that all of us come to terms with in our social compact between a society and a government. And it looks to me, even in the case of Pakistan, like that these are predominantly positive developments, and we ought to be much more enthusiastic about the change that's taking place.
We're going to go to the audience in a moment, so I'll get you to prepare your questions, but I want to come back to this question of civil-military relations and the role that the United States plays there. As you suggested, Corey, we've tended to bet on governments that have depended on their military. The military have basically played a critical role. The Mubarak regime was a military regime. In Indonesia, of course, we were dealing with militarily dominated, we were dealing with generals for so long. So there are two sides to this question in a way, and I'll get Andy to start, please, which is, the first question is, how did you manage to push the military out of government? Because that's critically important when it comes to talking about Egypt. I'll get Nabil to address that. And the second part of the question is, what's the role of the United States in that process of developing a truly civilian government in which the military returns to its barracks?
Thank you. I always make comparison between what happened in Indonesia when we got rid of our dictator Suharto with what happened in Egypt when they got rid of Hosni Mubarak. The difference is when Suharto stepped down, power went to his vice president. It could have gone to the military or the military council like in Egypt. But no, it was decided, the military decided, okay, they're not going to grab power, but they were still there. But it went to President Habibie, who's a civilian, and then he was the one who started to push the reforms. I think in Egypt it went the other way. The power went to the military and not the vice president, and this is what we are seeing now. And I always say, I always look at if the power had gone to the military in Indonesia, we would have been like where Egypt is today. Or if power had gone to the vice president in Egypt, probably Egypt would be going through the process that Indonesia went through.
Except the vice president turned out to be a general in Egypt too. So
okay.
It probably wouldn't have worked that way.
Anyway, the military, I think, once after Suharto stepped down, the military remained well, not in control, but was still very powerful and was still calling some of the shots for 2 years. And then President Abdurrahman Wahid decided, just for once and for all, he fired General Wiranto, and that virtually sort of ended the dual function of the military in defense and in politics. But the military is still part of the state. We cannot completely decimate them. They had some very bad records of violation of human rights. But still, I think as a nation, I think people will still felt that we have to keep the military proud of themselves. And this is where I think the United States and other governments played a role in helping to reform the military. Right? When we started the political reforms, we went through all the various state institutions, including the military and the police. And one of the first things we did actually separate the police from the military and created a division of labor, the military solely for defense and police for security. And that virtually take the military out of the political.
Did you have amnesty also for the military?
We went through the process of prosecuting some of the generals for the for the kidnappings, for some of the horrible the mayhem in East Timor. Well, the problem with our judiciary was it was not reformed fast enough, and so these generals went to court, but they were actually initially convicted, but then they were acquitted at on appeals. But at least we went through the process, and I think there is still a problem of impunity. But these generals are now out of power. Yeah? They're already retiring, and we have a new crop of military officers who did not serve in East Timor, for example. Right? So they're not as tainted. And they were the ones among the first crops of leaders from the military who came from the reform process. I'm not saying the reform is complete, but it started, and I think there was a lot of pressure for the military to not to go back into the politics, and they agreed because they wanted to build a more credible and professional military. I mean, that's the objective. They wanted to have more funding. And the government, the elected civilian government, agreed. Okay, let's increase our spending for the military, for the welfare of the soldiers, for the weapons, because we also we don't have any enemies in the region. But we want to have a military who looks as credible in terms of their equipment as other countries in our neighborhood. And this is exactly what we are doing. I think the military is quite happy with the arrangement now. They are out of politics, but they are able to build slowly because the budget is being increased slowly to build their credibility as a truly professional force.
Great, Nabil, what's the role of the military going to be in Egypt's political future? And here the United States does have a considerable role to play. And I just wonder, what as an Egyptian Democrat, do you want the United States to do in terms of its relationship with the Egyptian military?
Well, let me start by saying that during the 18 days of the revolution, when we were looking at what models can be used to sort of come out of it with the revolutionaries feeling satisfied, but moving on to a stable process, everybody talked to us about Turkey. Many of us said, well, let's look at Indonesia. So that was on our mind. But Martin, you're right. Even though there was a proposal to hand it over to the vice president, he was a military person, but that proposal was meant to hand it over to him to give it to a presidential council, and then you move on. But what's different here is Egyptians were angry with the security services. In their mind, that was the police and intelligence, not the military. Where there are real grievances before the revolution, it was with the police. One can argue that the debate about economic assets of the military are out there now, but there aren't really egregious human rights violations that are being addressed at the military previously. The military keep telling us, we didn't ask to play this role. You put us in the position of government. They initially said they'd be out in 6 months. I told them at the very beginning, you can't possibly finish in 6 months because you can't develop a constitution and change of government and all that. But today, we are debating every day. What's the role of the military? Do they get special privileges? Do they announce the budget? Is it part of the government budget? And all of these things, and you mentioned previously I'd worked in arms control, we have never announced the budget. I mean, I know what it is because I work on the subject, but we've never actually done that. So this whole debate is really out there. There were different attempts to codify, even by liberals trying to be pragmatic. And they came up with a document that gave the military rights and privileges, but they weren't accepted in the street, and it was immediately pushed back. So the street still is quite vocal. If you look at the 71 Constitution, all it says about the military is they defend the borders. They have no additional rights in the Constitution beyond defending the borders. The debate on the new Constitution, whether in the Constitution, I mean, why are they having a problem now? Because the next president will be an elected president who is not a member of the military. So they want something codified which wasn't codified in the past. But I'm very confident that even though I said, and I believe this is going to take us time. We need to take time to do this. I honestly believe that if there isn't a balance between equity and, if you want, also a guarantee for civilian liberties, the street is always out there. I would not encourage people to demonstrate every day. People are getting very tired. We have severe economic constraints. But the military will have much fewer privileges and rights than they had in the past, whether or not we codify them. And I don't, honestly, I really do not see them playing a political role 2 or 3 years from now.
Let's hope so, from your mouth to the general's ears. Okay, Khaled El-Gendi first, please.
Khaled El-Gendi with the Brookings Institute. My question is for Corey. There's been a discourse the last year within Republican circles. I'm going to sort of put you on the spot. And it's particularly with regard to the Arab awakening, and it's been very much couched in zero-sum terms. The rise of the Islamists in particular is seen as disastrous on some level for the United States, for Israel, and for the West in general. There's a similar zero-sum discourse with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that it is even greater urgency to absolutely become unequivocally supportive of Israel. What is your advice to those in Republican circles on these issues in terms of a more nuanced discourse, given the fact that we could have a Romney administration that would have to deal with an elected Islamist government, for example, from somewhere in the region?
You know, there's a terrific social scientist in the United States Bob Putnam, who has a book just out about religious tolerance in America. And it looks at kind of who we're afraid of at different times and why. And his basic conclusion is that once you know someone from that group, whether it's a Mormon or a Jew, the stereotypes that we have get shattered, and then they become a lot less frightening. And actually, in this book, their recommendation to Muslim Americans is to open the doors a little bit and engage more broadly with people outside their own community, because that will reduce general kind of concern among Americans about Muslim Americans. And I think that holds true more generally. The stereotype of of Islamist parties is Hamas and Hezbollah. But that's also clearly not the entire spectrum of Islamic political thought, of Islamic religious thought, and it seems to me that one of the things that broke American attitudes about, or stereotypes about this, is the quite constructive role that Ayatollah Sistani has played in Iraq. Colin could speak to this much better than I, but the kind of pole of the Iranian model is the model that Ayatollah Sistani has pioneered in Iraq, where religious leaders set the boundaries of political space, but don't engage directly in politics. And so I think our familiarity grows with the broad spectrum of political parties and political actors in this wonderful new landscape of Muslim democracies, that will diminish. Of course, that also depends on their choices, right? If they choose intolerant policies, if they scapegoat others in their community, right, that will of course have an effect too. It does seem to me though that we are already getting much more comfortable with the breadth of political actors that are coming to power in countries that are, because American democracy is messy. American democracy, like the things that are true of us are blessedly becoming true of others as well. And we can navigate that space. We actually, one of my grand theories about American foreign policy is that when we get stuff wrong, it's because we are good as a society at a whole lot of things that we are not necessarily good at as a government at doing. And if you go back to the societal answers in the United States, you usually get better foreign policies. And I think that's where we're headed on this. Specifically with regard to the debate in Republican circles, I think there are two things driving it. And it is about the legacy of the Bush administration, which a lot of conservatives are deeply uncomfortable about on two fronts. First, spending levels, right? Because good conservatives are cheap, and the Bush administration spent a lot of money. Second, on the level of activism in American foreign policy. And again, this is a traditional debate about whether we should just exemplify what we want to see in the world or whether we should be actively engaged in doing it. And I think Martin's point was a very good one, which is that Americans are weary. It's been a rough decade for us as well as a rough decade for others. And at a time where 40 cents of every dollar the American government spends, it is borrowing because we haven't gotten our own financial house in order. It's quite a high threshold to ask Americans to spend money for things overseas and at home. Moreover, it's asking quite a lot of Americans after how fraught the last 10 years have been to take an active role in reshaping the international order. I think we are going to miss a lot of opportunities as a result of that, and that's a real pity. And another president might be exhorting Americans much more enthusiastically about the opportunities at hand, but I do think President Obama accurately reflects the much more modest attitudes that Americans have about what we're willing to do in the world right now.
Ayatollah Ravani.
Thank you very much, Iravani from Washington, D.C., but since I'm from Iran and Iran has mentioned a few times,
Please.
I realized to say a few words, if you don't mind, about my perspective of how I see this situation with regard with Iranian influence in the region. Although I agree with mismanagement of Iranian government about its own election, and I am among those people who criticized and was not happy with what happened with Iran, and the government was able to do it in a much better way than they did it, but saying that it doesn't mean that Iran doesn't have influence in the region. I'm coming, after 2 years, I went now from US to Iraq and then to Iran. I had meetings with Grand Ayatollahs in Iraq and different parts of the region, and I was surprised the influence of Iran in the region among the people and among the leaders in Iraq. I was really surprised to see that by myself. And historically speaking, Iran as a Shia country has a sympathy of the Shias in the region, regardless of who's in charge of Iran system. That's something we should have. Now, removal or a departure of American soldiers in Iraq, planning of leaving Afghanistan. These give a better opportunity for Iran to play its role in that part. Now, still Iran has lots of influence in Hezbollah, within Lebanon, within Syria, with Bahrain, with other countries. So the question I have, I think, American and especially American West and Iran have more natural interest in the region than anyone else. Why the West are not going to use this influence of Iran in a positive direction? And in my meeting with Iranian also officials, I felt that they are ready for that as well. Especially having the fatwa of the supreme leader of Iran recently said this is haram as to using and production and prevention, using and production and
deployment
and preservation of this nuclear weapon is haram. That's something I think the West should take it seriously and try to build a trust. There is a mistrust between these two countries, and especially US and Iran, and needs lots of work in a positive way. And I think in that way, and then we have a better Middle East.
Thank you. Colin, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, in some ways I agree with the general sentiment that I think if you could get past a number of obstacles, there is a fairly wide spectrum of issues of common interest that we could cooperate on. Just to take one small one, but the drug trade across the border from Afghanistan into Iran is a perfect example. But the obstacles aren't small. The fact remains that Iran is the chief state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and that Iran is pursuing what proliferation experts would describe as a nuclear hedging strategy. That is that there's no evidence that the Iranian regime has definitively decided to build nuclear weapons, but they're certainly putting all the pieces in place. Now, the fatwa that you reference actually goes back 7 years. It's been reiterated over and over again, and I think what President Obama has done, and I think this is constructive, is to use the Supreme Leader's words as the starting point for giving the regime a face-saving way out on the nuclear issue. But the regime has to do more to generate confidence in the international community. It's producing 20% low-enriched uranium, ostensibly for the Tehran research reactor, in excess of its requirements for humanitarian purposes. There's no explanation for that. It generates a large stockpile of 3.5% low-enriched uranium, even though it doesn't need that fuel because it gets the fuel for the Bushehr reactor from the Russians. They have past activities that they've engaged in that have had military dimensions that have been documented by the IAEA, and yet the Iranians aren't letting the IAEA get access to the Parchin site. In fact, we woke up to news this morning that new satellite imagery shows that that building is being razed to the ground and scrubbed before the IAEA ever gets to it, which on the surface strikes me as odd. So look, this is a huge challenge. I think that the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus Germany, the so-called P5+1, have outlined a number of steps that the Iranian regime could take, starting with halting enrichment at the 20% level and removing the stockpile of 20% low-enriched uranium, stopping activities at Fordo, which was the covert nuclear enrichment site under the mountain at Qom that was outed by the Obama administration in the fall of 2009. And in exchange for that, they would get technical cooperation for the Tehran research reactor and some other benefits, and to use this as a stepping stone to have the type of broader conversation and potentially a grand bargain or a final settlement that would resolve international concerns about Iran's nuclear program, while allowing Iran to have its rights under the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, respected, allow the Supreme Leader's words to stand on their own. That is, that Iran does not seek nor does it want to develop nuclear weapons, but they just have to assure the international community through full transparency and accountability that that's actually the fact. And if we can get beyond that, I think that there are these avenues for cooperation on maritime security, on counterterrorism, on stability in Afghanistan and elsewhere. But both sides have to come to the table. And I think after a good start in Istanbul, what we saw in Baghdad was that both sides probably came to the table with expectations that were not in sync with one another. And hopefully in Moscow in a couple of weeks, now having these opening bids been put on the table, both sides can find the beginning of a way out of the current impasse.
Corey, just hold for a moment,
Okay.
because our time is short. I see a few hands. What I'd like to do is simply, can I just have a show of hands of who really wants to ask a question? Yeah, that's all right, Solomon, you could ask. Emil, you didn't want to? Okay. So let's just take all the questions, and then I'll get all three of you to respond and kind of wrap up quickly. So short questions, short answers. Yes, please, down the back. Yes.
نائب زيدان من الأردن. صحيح أنا استمعت يعني خلال اليومين الماضيين لكثير من الحديث. لاحظت أنه في البعد الاستراتيجي أنه المسألة تتعلق بأمن إسرائيل مقابل أمن المنطقة هي المعضلة التي تواجه أمريكا في المستقبل. لقد حاولت أمريكا أن تصنع سلاماً مع الأنظمة فذهبت الأنظمة، وعجزت هذه الأنظمة أن تصنع سلاماً مع الشعوب. الشعوب الآن ما زالت غاضبة وتعكس هذا الغضب بأنها تريد حلاً عادلاً للقضية الفلسطينية. وأنا يعني أؤكد تماماً أن لو أزيل حجراً في المسجد الأقصى من مكانه لهاج المسلمون من جاكرتا إلى اسطنبول. حقيقة يعني هذا البعد الاستراتيجي في العلاقة الولايات المتحدة مع شعوب العالم الإسلامي يجعل هذه المسألة يجب أن يتم الحديث عنها بشفافية ووضوح، وأن تثبت الولايات المتحدة أنها جادة فعلا في المرحلة القادمة أن تصنع سلاما حقيقيا في هذه المنطقة، ليس بحاجة شعوب المنطقة أن تنتظر 10 زعماء أمريكان قادمون حتى نصل إلى حل. السؤال إلى المتحدثين في الندوة أنه هل الأنظمة التي سيفرزها الربيع العربي ستتجه شرقا يأسا من موقف الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية؟ وشكرا.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just building on the question from the gentleman, I guess.
Could you identify yourself, please?
My name is Bilal Sabir. I'm a Palestinian refugee. For decades, I've been describing myself as that. Anyway, the idea is, as the voice of the people, become more important in this region, how will that change the dynamic of the relationship, of the struggle, the Palestinian-Israeli question? And the thing is, and the response of the United States. The United States, as I understand from such initiatives as this forum, is interested in having a long-term, sustainable relationship with the Muslim world, and now that means the people of the Muslim world, not the governments of the Muslim world. The people of the Muslim world expect consistency for trust. Consistency in that the United States has always been asking for human rights. They've been asking for democracy. They've been asking for solutions that are based on these values that we are all supposed to share. And then comes this exceptionalism in the case of Israel. And in Israel, we have a continuous process of ethnic cleansing since '48 and still ongoing today. Things like the settlements is an act of ethnic cleansing. The wall is an act of ethnic cleansing. The suffocation of Gaza is a mechanism of ethnic cleansing. The Judaization of Jerusalem is a mechanism of ethnic cleansing. The laws inside of Israel, the laws inside of Israel against the non-Jewish population is also a mechanism of ethnic cleansing.
So
the point is, the question is, when will the United States, or whether the United States will, for example, choose between the short-term interests of the Israeli governments that are actually committing such crimes and the long-term interests of the Jewish population in the region. If they are serious about sustainable peace, should they not look at the outlook? You know, the long-term interests of integrating the Jewish communities in the Holy Land, in the region, in a peaceful and meaningful way. Otherwise, the alternative is going to be very harsh. So, is it time for the United States to focus on the long-term, you know, of having good relationships with the region and good outcome for the Jewish population in the region, or do you think they will continue to focus on the short term, for example, like saying, okay, we support a Jewish state, an exclusive state as opposed to an inclusive state?
Okay,
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Anybody else? Salman.
Thank you, Martin. I have start with a simple question. Did we actually learn anything in the last year and a half that we didn't learn in the last 30, 40 years of dictatorship? I think we're all in our working groups and in other conversations understanding that it is important perhaps to speak to a wider group of people rather than just focusing on narrow groups within these states. That it is better to pursue, where possible, a broader than just a security approach where you just support militaries, and where it's perhaps better to do things in a more open way and a more transparent way than behind closed doors. I asked this question in particular because US Islamic Forum, we're not just talking about the Arab world now, we're still talking about other Muslim majority regions like Central Asia or the Caucasus, where I bet you people are also wanting much more dignity and support and development. And surely there are lessons that can be learned from this period, which we may well not fully learn even here, but which we should perhaps also be thinking about elsewhere.
Okay. If the last question over here.
شكرا. كمال عمار عضو في المجلس التأسيسي بتونس. أنا أقول إذا كانت الثورات العربية تؤسس لتغيرات استراتيجية وجيوسياسية عميقة في المنطقة، وتتجه هذه التغيرات إلى إبراز الإسلام باعتباره منظومة فكرية ثقافية تؤسس لكل أبعاد الوجود السياسي والاقتصادي والاجتماعي لهذه الدول، وتؤسس أيضا لكيانات جديدة، إعادة قوة المغرب العربي إلى آخره. فإلى أي مدى اليوم أمريكا والغرب مستعدة إلى التعامل مع الإسلام بهذا الشكل؟ لم يعد هناك فكرة الفصل بين الدين والدولة، فهذا يعني وقع تجاوزه إلى حد كبير. فهذه النقطة الأولى الاستراتيجية الهامة، إلى أي مدى اليوم أمريكا والغرب مستعدة للتعامل مع الإسلام كمنظومة فكرية سياسية تشريعية لكل أبعاد وجود الدولة المدنية سياسيا واقتصاديا إلى آخره. المسألة الثانية الهامة أيضا أن هذه الثورات رفعت شعار الشعب يريد تحرير فلسطين، وأن هذا الشعار رفع في مصر وفي تونس وفي ليبيا وفي اليمن إلى آخره. ونحن نعرف أن الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية عندما ضربت العراق اعتمدت كذبة سخيفة وهي وجود السلاح النووي، وكانت الخلفية أمن إسرائيل والخلفية هي الحفاظ أو السيطرة على منابع الطاقة في المنطقة. فإلى أي مدى أيضا أمريكا اليوم مستعدة إلى أن تعيد السيناريو مع إيران؟ ثم نحن نعرف أن أيضا حماس وصلت إلى السلطة بانتخابات شفافة وبانتخابات ديمقراطية، لكن وقع الانقلاب عليها باسم أنها إرهابية. إلى أي مدى أيضا اليوم تستطيع أمريكا في علاقتها بإسرائيل أن تتعامل مع هذه المسألة تعاملا يبين أن الشعوب لم تعد في حاجة إلى سلاح نووي اليوم في علاقتها أو في إرادتها بما يحدث اليوم في فلسطين وما تمارسه إسرائيل من تصفية عرقية، من تهجير، من يعني رفض أي تعامل مع الفلسطينيين بشكل يمكنهم من حقوقهم التاريخية.
I think we dealt with that question already, but okay, thank you. Andy, first of all, there was a question about will the Arab Spring head east? And I guess the big question there is, and whether you've got a perspective on that, is are we going to see kind of democratization take place in China?
Well, I think democracy is, what do you call it? It's like a virus, yeah? And it spreads. And especially with the social media, now people are becoming aware about the choices that they have if they have freedom and democracy. And this, I think, what triggered in some ways, what triggered the Arab awakening. And this is, like I said, it's contagious. So in other countries, I'm sure, like in Central Asia, they are also becoming aware about the possibilities. You know, I have endured 30 years of dictatorship, but for the last 14 years, I have lived in a democracy with all its flaws and shortcomings, but I would not trade democracy and freedom for, for the stability of the authoritarian regimes. And I think, going to the question about the Middle East peace process, the question about, the need for a quick solution, I think that will have to wait, because one of the biggest players in this peace process is obviously Egypt, right? Besides the Palestinians, the Israelis, United States, but Egypt has to be a player. This is why I stated the importance of a regional power, and Egypt is one, to play a role in the peace process. And the good thing about democracy is that although it is unpredictable in some ways about the winners, but like Ambassador Nabil mentioned, it also means more transparency and more openness, and therefore democracy is unpredictable when it comes to the winners of the elections. But when it comes to the government or the governing, I think because of the process, whether it's Muslim Brotherhood or any government, and they have to be accountable. They, have to go back to the people every 4 or 5 years, and that compels them to be more transparent. And all kinds of possibilities are out there, including, I'm more optimistic about democracy leading to the solutions rather than, in the past, a dictator government trying to find a solution in the Middle East.
Okay, thank you. Corey, on the question of is the United States going to solve the Palestinian problem or ignore its short-term interests?
How I wish we could. First, on the issue of short-term interest. Now, actually, let me start on the characterization of Israel, because that's actually not my experience, and the real vehemence with which you are demonizing the Israelis, I actually think makes the likelihood of a Palestinian settlement much less likely. And so, advice you didn't ask for, I actually think you're likelier to get what you want with a different approach than the one that you have. My sense about the short-term, the way you characterize short-term interests also doesn't ring true to me, because it does seem to me that the best indicator of Israeli interests is Israeli voting patterns, right? Like, democracies reflect the interests of their citizens. And one of the really wonderful things about the change that's been going on in the Middle East in the last several years is that all sorts of governments, and not just the Israeli government, are becoming much more representative and much more accountable. One of the downsides of that, I think, is that many other countries are becoming much more focused, as several people on panels said, with their own elections and their own social transformations, and that is actually probably diminishing their interest in advancing the Palestinian cause. And so I think that's an adjustment Palestinians need to make. I am myself quite heartened at a lot of the choices Palestinians have made in the last several years. I think the focus on building a functional state in Palestine that benefits the people of Palestine. Actually, that's the point in time a couple of years ago when I really thought there was a possibility for a solution, and that I think the last few American governments, the Clinton administration, second-term Bush administration and surely the Obama administration had been very actively engaged in that diplomacy, but just couldn't get anywhere. And the reason we couldn't get anywhere is because Israelis and Palestinians couldn't find the common cause for agreement on that. I don't think you're likely to see the United States try and impose that kind of agreement, in part because we see so little progress that is being made on it. I think this is hard. We're not going to get a near-term solution, nice as it would be if we could. I just don't see what that basis looks like right now.
Colin, do you want to respond on the Palestinian question, also maybe on Salman's question about what we've learned?
Yeah, let me go in the reverse direction. You know, have we learned anything? There's an old saying about revolutions that prospectively they look impossible, but retrospectively they seem inevitable. Right? So everybody looks at the Arab awakening and they say, well, of course. Youth bulges, unemployment, poverty, corruption, illegitimate regimes, et cetera, but nobody was predicting this a year and a half ago. Not because people didn't see the structural flaws in these societies and in the way in which they were being governed, but because there were myths about the fatalism of the Arab street and the omnipresence and omnipotence of the security apparatuses of states across the Arab world, and those myths have been shattered. I think one of the unbelievable things, you know, if you think about how the Arab Spring began in Tunisia and Egypt with largely peaceful protests, and how it continues in Syria today, they're both remarkable in different ways, right? One, that the revolutions were possible in Tunisia and Egypt without a lot of violence, and that today, that so many brave and courageous Syrians continue to take the streets in the face of extraordinary violence by their government. And I think what that says is the fear barrier of governments, which kept the lid on revolutions for so long in this part of the world, has been shattered, and perhaps permanently so. I would say one of the things as a consumer of information and intelligence on inside the government during the Arab Spring, you know, we learned on 9/11 in the United States government that we weren't doing a very good job tracking uncivil society, right? Terrorist organizations. We were focused on states and militaries of other countries and things, and the Cold War dynamic and everything else, and we weren't looking at networks of organizations that could do us harm. Well, we've made an equal and perhaps even more significant error in not looking at civil society. And so we saw the structural conditions, but we had no capability to predict timing because we weren't looking at the right actors. And I think that we're still just starting to figure out who the right actors are. And sometimes you can learn more from, you know, I could learn more from my Twitter feed than from my morning intel briefing. And that there's something in that. And I think we need to continue to explore it. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you know, look, President Obama, this is not just an intellectual, you know, he understands intellectually the strategic importance of an of a Palestinian-Israeli agreement. But he's emotionally and personally invested in this, and it was one of the first things that he did as president within 48 hours of assuming the office was to stand up a special representative and to wade deep into these waters, even though they've proven so difficult. The fact of the matter is you have an Israeli government and a Palestinian government that don't trust each other. They are ideologically very far apart. On day-to-day, there are indignities and slights on both sides that give hardliners plenty of ammunition to not negotiate. And this is just really, really, really hard. And I think what the Arab Spring has done is simultaneously raise the importance of solving the Arab-Israeli conflict, because I think as these elections come in country after country, Israel will become a wedge issue. I mean, we've talked about how things like immigration or gay marriage become wedge issues in the United States. Well, Israel will be a wedge issue in election after election. And you know, one of the last trips I took with Secretary Robert Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, was to Israel, and he made the passionate argument to both Prime Minister Netanyahu and to Minister of Defense Ehud Barak that it was in Israel's interest to get out in front of this populist wave by taking some risks for peace. It's still in Israel's interest to do that. It's also in the Palestinians' interest to do that. But there's so much uncertainty in the strategic environment that it's difficult for parties on either side to accept risk at the very moment that they need to take risk. And so while the Arab Spring has made the importance of the Arab-Israeli conflict in settling the Palestinian issue more important than ever, it's also made it more difficult for leaders in many respects to do it. And there's a paradox in that. And you know, one last thing I'll say. Look, this is just really hard. And whoever's the next president, whether it's President Obama or Mitt Romney or somebody who comes out of left field, I don't think it will be somebody else. this is going to be an issue they're going to have to deal with. And I think at the moment, the American election is focused very, very much on domestic policy and the economy. Governor Romney has not said very much about the peace process. But I hope as we move into the actual campaign and away from the Republican primaries, he moves beyond the statement that just that the United States shouldn't be all that involved in the peace process. Because I think that's just not in our interest. We can't force an agreement on the parties, but we can't be aloof from the process or being seen as one-sided either. So I think inevitably whoever the next president is, they'll have to wade back into these waters. It's in our strategic interest, it's in our moral interest, and it's in the interest of both, at the end of the day, of both Israelis and Palestinians.
Great, thank you. I would just make one final, very short comment, which brings us back to the strategic shifts we started talking about at the beginning, which is that if Hamas has indeed shifted out of the Iranian rejectionist camp into the Egyptian camp, which happens to be a country whose leadership are vying for, those who are vying for leadership are both saying they will respect the peace treaty with Israel, it may just be that the Egyptian leadership that emerges democratically will have greater influence on Hamas and greater ability to support a unified Palestinian actor engaging in peace with Israel. So maybe there's still hope for resolving the conflict. Thank you all our panelists very much, and thank you to the audience for an excellent session.